Really honored to introduce Emily Gottreich, a world historian specializing in Middle Eastern, North African, and Jewish history with a focus on Jewish-Muslim relations in Morocco and the broader Arab Islamic world. She serves as adjunct professor of global studies at UC Berkeley with faculty affiliations in the departments of history and Middle Eastern languages and cultures. From 2014 to 2020, Gottreich served as chair of UC Berkeley's Title VI Center for Middle Eastern Studies, where she's currently a senior research scholar. Her publications include The Mellah of Marrakesh, Jewish and Muslim Space in Morocco's Red City, and co-editor with Daniel Schroeder of Jewish Culture and Society in North Africa. Her most recent book is Jewish Morocco, a history from pre-Islamic to post-colonial times, and Emily's talk today is entitled Jewish Ghosts in the Arab Gulf.
Just a quick thank you to Dina and to Sam. It's just always such a pleasure to cross the street and come up the hill and feel like, it's not just our brains that are being taken care of, but it's our souls too. So that's been very meaningful to me my whole career. My talk today is going to bring us right up to the present, to basically a week ago. And it's going to take the form of semi-digested notes from the field. I just returned from the United Arab Emirates, where I was conducting research for my current book project, which is a multi-country study of the revival of Jewish heritage and history that is currently underway in many parts of the Islamic world. If you have heard bits and pieces of this before, I know. So the Islamicate Jewish Heritage Revival, as I call it, and I know that's a mouthful, but Islamicate, for those of you who don't know, it is a very useful term that was first introduced by the historian and sociologist Marshall Hodgson of the University of Chicago. And it was a way of talking about non-Muslims in Muslim society as true members of that society, of contributors to that society, and it's really nothing has replaced it as a way of kind of talking about how Jews in Muslim societies did not treat those societies as simply host societies. It's a very different model than perhaps we see in much of Jewish history elsewhere. Anyway, the Islamicate Jewish Heritage Revival is a vast and frankly somewhat paradoxical trend that encompasses almost every Muslim majority country in which Jews once lived, and even some places where they didn't, as we'll soon see. So in these various settings that range in my own research from Morocco, I work on Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, the Gulf, Turkey, and Indonesia. So in all those places, and also Bosnia, Herzegovina, in all these places, we see dozens of ancient synagogues that have been restored, like the ones we see here in Cairo and in Beirut. Hundreds of Jewish cemeteries have been refurbished, and Jewish museums are opening literally one after the other. So I seem to be missing a picture there. Let's see. There we go. Morocco, where as Sam mentioned, I did most of my research, is today home to no fewer than 4 Jewish museums. In Casablanca, in Essaouira, in Fez, and in Tangier. In Fez, you can note here, really interestingly, I think, my pointer's not going to point to that, but the use not only of Arabic and Hebrew, but of Tamazight, of the local Berber language. I say no fewer than 4 museums in Morocco, Jewish museums in Morocco, because there are at least, that I know of, 3 other informal museums about Jews, concerning Jews, in people's homes and things like that. It's truly quite a phenomenon. Now, I did say this trend is paradoxical, and it's paradoxical for several reasons. But one of the most important ones is because it's taking place largely in the absence of Jews, by which I mean actual embodied Jews, who, as we know, mostly emigrated from the Islamic world during the upheavals of the last century. Now, as a result of that exodus, of close to 1 million people, all of those painstakingly restored synagogues, you just saw images of 2 of them, are unlikely to ever host a minyan, just like this newly refurbished Jewish cemetery in Khartoum in Sudan is unlikely to receive many visitors, let alone additional inhabitants. The official Jewish population of Sudan is 0. I'm always very wary, nonetheless, of official populations of Jews being 0. They tend not to count Jewish women who are married into Muslim families, which you find throughout the Islamic world, but there's nobody downtown Khartoum raising their hand saying, I'm a Jew. That's what we know about that. Anyway, all of this is to say that Jewish heritage in the Islamic world is, to wit, the domain of ghosts. And that, of course, in turn begs the question of why. Why, in settings from Morocco in the west to Indonesia in the east, are scarce resources being put to restoring, renovating, and in some cases even manufacturing Jewish heritage sites anew? Now, I don't have time to give you the full answer to that question. Certainly, there are significant variations from place to place as to why these resources are being lent to these efforts and who's involved. But I think if we were going to kind of try and find a thread that carries through, I would say, to borrow Winston Churchill's famous phrasing, that the Jewish heritage revival in the contemporary Islamic world is a puzzle inside a riddle wrapped in an enigma, and the key to understanding it is global capitalism. Meaning, in a surprising number of Muslim-majority countries, the promotion of the real or fabricated memory of native Jews and of positive Muslim-Jewish relations has become part of a larger strategy of positioning these places as havens of diversity and progressiveness. And this positioning, in turn, brings tremendous reward. It's been very, very successful in a very short time. It provides access to global markets, institutions, and Western approval. We'll see, you can see this dynamic writ large in something like the Abraham Accords, which is actually directly linked to the development of Jewish heritage sites, at least in those places that signed the Accords: Morocco, Bahrain, the Emirates, and Sudan again. In short, performing tolerance, specifically the tolerance of Jews, is the surest way to signal you are the moderate Muslim that the West has been eagerly looking for since 9/11. And if it's not too vulgar a phrase, we might call this strategy Jew washing, in the way that it mimics, of course, pink washing in the context of the performance of LGBTQ friendliness, or greenwashing in environmental contexts. And Jew washing is all the easier to accomplish when the Jews in question are merely ghosts, when they're a present absence, in the evocative phrasing of the Moroccan anthropologist Omar Boum. So without embodied Jews like those who once lived alongside their Muslim neighbors, Islamic Jewish heritage has become untethered. It's a signifier without a signified, which then, of course, can be pressed into whatever service the circumstances require. Now, the historiographic ramifications of this are quite profound, and my larger work deals a lot with that. There's an idea put forward by people like Bernard Lewis and others, big historians of the Jews of the Islamic world, who basically said with the emigration of Jews in the last 2 quarters of the 20th century, the history of Muslim-Jewish relations came to an end. And in Israel, there's a holiday commemorating this exodus that also reifies this idea of an end to that history. Well, a lot of my argument is, well, no, it is continuing in the 21st century, just in very different forms. But the history of Muslim-Jewish relations is far from over. Nonetheless, as Muslim-Jewish relations are increasingly being removed from the concrete legal context of dhimma, the Islamic legal status under which Jews and Christians lived, and are being recast to suit the values of today's globalizing world, intercommunal histories become open, become vulnerable to new modes of interpretation and even, I would say, manipulation. So the use of Jewish heritage sans Jews, of course, is not without precedent. We know historically that Judenrein cities like Krakow and Cordova have similarly mined their Jewish pasts for the sake of current needs. But I do think that in this particular context, it has accrued new meanings and new expression here in the contemporary Islamic world. So I want to zero in my talk on what this actually looks like in the Gulf, and specifically the United Arab Emirates. And of course, I'd be happy to take questions about any other of these settings in the Q&A. So on my last evening in the United Arab Emirates, I was way up north in Ras Al Khaimah, one of the northernmost emirates, staring across the misty straits to Iran, waiting for iftar, the end of the Ramadan fast for that day, waiting for that to begin. I wasn't hungry because I myself was fasting, I was not, but because earlier that day I'd encountered a ghost. And ghosts, of course, make us crave the material. This particular ghost's name was David ben Moshe, David, son of Moses. And this is his gravestone. It's an irregular slab of local black limestone, about 60 by 40 centimeters, covered in a worn Hebrew inscription. It's not dated, but it's estimated to be from 16th to the early 17th century, which was in a period of increased Portuguese involvement in the trade in the Arabian Gulf in this area. Was actually found by local tribesmen in 1970, so the year before the United Arab Emirates actually became a country. It was being used as a stepping stone to get access to a well. Importantly, it was found alone. It's the only one like it. It was not found in a cemetery, meaning that David was not part of a local community, which makes sense because historically there were no Jewish communities in what is today the United Arab Emirates. Indeed, there weren't very many people at all in that region, though Ras Al Khaimah, that northernmost emirate, then known as Julfa, did have an active pearl trade. So it's likely that David was a merchant who perhaps died while traveling through this area. And as we know, Jewish law requires prompt burial. So that's perhaps how he ended up there. He may have come from the nearby kingdom of Hormuz. Hormuz is a little island in the straits there that contained a large Persian-speaking Jewish community. And actually, Daniel Frank from Oxford originally deciphered and translated the inscription of this from rubbings that were sent to him, and he suggested that some of the formulas included here are Persian-inflected, which again was the language of the Jews of Hormuz. And here, the gravestone is housed in this very modest museum, the National Museum of Ras Al Khaimah. Of course, modest is a relative term when it comes to the Gulf, but you are given a local guide, and she was very knowledgeable about the gravestone. So Jewish communities might not have been present in what is today the United Arab Emirates historically, but they certainly were present elsewhere in the Arabian Gulf, in the peninsula and the Gulf region, as we see in this map of Lake Antique Arabia, the southern part of it. In what is now Yemen, in the southern part, of course, there is the famous Jewish kingdom of Himyar. Further north in what is today Saudi Arabia, we know that Jews, of course, were among the Prophet Muhammad's first interlocutors in Medina. And then, I don't think we can see it on this map, sort of on the northeast side there, in the modern era, in the 19th century, what we call Baghdadi Jews established outposts in what are today Kuwait and Oman and Bahrain. But not in the Emirates, not in the area of the Emirates. In the Emirates, there's only David ben Moshe. Now, despite this fact, but really not despite it, really because of this fact, the United Arab Emirates is where some of the most elaborate Jewish heritage projects are being undertaken. I'll give you just a few examples, and my talk is actually quite short, so we'll have time to talk about the details later. But I just have 3 examples I'd like to show you. The first one, and the most dramatic one, is this: the monumental Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi. It features a church on the right with the straight lines, the mosque on the left with the curves, and a synagogue in the center. It's, quote, a remarkable symbol of interfaith unity, showcasing the coexistence of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in a single space. So the site opened just a year ago, in February of last year. It was designed by the British Ghanaian architect David Adjaya. The budget they never disclosed publicly, but they say it was around $500 million, paid for by the Emirates. It is truly stunning. The architecture is truly stunning. I wanted to hate this place. I really wanted to hate it. I couldn't. It felt like heaven. The mosque, you walk into the mosque, and hundreds of people are walking in here every day. But of course, in a mosque, you take off your shoes. But it is covered wall-to-wall white plush carpet. I mean, it's hard to imagine that in a public building anywhere else. I don't know if people have been to the Emirates. It's an extremely clean place. So the mosque is quite stunning. So are the other 2 buildings as well. It's incredibly sleek, as are many things in the Emirates. It's also incredibly ahistorical. To the best of my knowledge, this kind of juxtaposition never existed probably anywhere. I'm not a historian of everywhere, though, so I can say in an Islamic city, this juxtaposition did not exist. If Jews were not segregated from above, as they were in Morocco, they certainly self-segregated, as did Christians. And so synagogues and churches were both separate from each other in places where you had both populations. And of course, both of those were separate from mosques for the most part. And in fact, the strictures, the religious and legal strictures surrounding that legal status of dhimma I mentioned would have made this kind of configuration impossible. One of the rules of dhimma historically was that you couldn't ring your church bells in such a way that a Muslim might hear that or be offended by that. By the way, interestingly, just coming back to the broader scope of this project, this same configuration of mosque, synagogue, church is now being done in a neighborhood in Marrakesh as well. Here's the interior of the synagogue with mechitza. It's all very religious. Chabad is very involved in this, by the way. When I was there was a Chabad rabbi just kind of hanging out there, which makes sense, right? Because the Islam in the Emirates is also very traditional. So it's the most conservative, and of course the Pope and the Catholic, it's a Catholic church, and the Pope is involved in that. So it's sort of the most conservative elements of each religious tradition that are represented here. I just want to quickly point out the use of this term Abrahamic, which is an important discursive tool, symbol of tolerance. In these contexts, it's being used in the service of performing some kind of tolerance in globalization. In that context, the values and goals of globalization are expressed in Abrahamic togetherness, but it also follows in the footsteps of earlier models for intercommunal relations. I'm thinking of phrases, concepts like convivencia, that became very popular in the 1990s, just as Spain was commemorating 500 years of the Reconquista, going back to the 19th century, and some of the German Jewish scholars like Shlomo Dov Goitein would use the idea of symbiosis. So this is just another one of those slightly ahistorical terms that has become very popular. Now, second site here, speaking of tolerance, in this site, the Crossroads of Civilization Museum in Dubai, Muslim tolerance is implicitly, maybe even explicitly contrasted with Christian intolerance. This is a private museum consisting of a wide collection of books, of objects. There's a whole part that has different kinds of traditional weapons, paintings, there's books, all kinds of things belonging to one Ahmed Obeid al-Mansouri, who is an Emirati businessman. He also has held governmental positions. The museum itself opened in 2014, but in 2021 it opened a Holocaust gallery. It's actually the largest of the museum's 3 galleries. And it intersperses Jewish artifacts like you see on the left, which is something, text that was rescued from a Czechoslovakian Jewish community in the Holocaust. And then alongside that, you have images along the walls of historical Jewish communities of the Islamic world, and also tributes to righteous Gentiles, Muslim saviors of Jews. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but the important underlying message is that European Christians did this to Jews. We Muslims didn't do this to Jews. We were tolerant. In these contexts, dhimma, again, for those of you familiar with that term, is often actually glossed as tolerance. It gets defined as tolerance, which of course is inaccurate. Dhimma literally means protection, and it was the protection given to certain recognized non-Muslim minorities living under Islamic rule in exchange for paying a special tax and observing certain restrictions. Dhimma is not quite tolerance, it's very hierarchical. Nonetheless, if we think about it, and something that gets lost in a lot of the contemporary discourse, is the fact that tolerance is also quite hierarchical, right? What do you tolerate? You tolerate that which you would otherwise abhor. I'll also, again, to broaden our scope, mention that in Indonesia, they also, within the last 2 years, opened a Holocaust museum. I'll be going to look at that in the winter. Now, in case you don't get the point, in this museum, this is this very large mural in the courtyard called the Cousins mural, in case you can't read both languages. Ibn Amri, Ben Dodi, both cousins in Arabic and in Hebrew, made by an Israeli artist. The third and final site I want to mention is the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, which of course brings us back to our gravestones here in a very creative and beautiful juxtaposition. Again, the Louvre Abu Dhabi it's an incredible museum. I actually preferred it to the Louvre in Paris in the sense that you can kind of go through the whole thing within 2 hours, and there's definitely a narrative there that is about all of this, about tolerance, about all humanity coming together, moving towards globalization, and what do you know, the Emirates are kind of at the apex of all of that. Again, creative and beautiful, nonetheless historically problematic. So to conclude, I realize this all sounds quite cynical. And we're talking about emotional topics today. And my emotions on this particular topic are actually quite mixed. I do think there is a way in which the overt anti-Semitism of the 20th century, which was, of course, largely a European product, is being recalibrated as philo-Semitism in the 21st century Islamic world. But I also think that's not necessarily a bad thing. Philo-Semitism is a totally unstudied topic compared to anti-Semitism, which I think is the most studied field in the larger field of Jewish studies. I read that recently. Compared to that, certainly philo-Semitism we know very, very little about. There are not many books written about it. They are almost all about Europe. There's an exception. There's one on philo-Semitism, I think, in China or Japan, and one in South America. Absolutely nothing, zero, written on philo-Semitism in the Islamic world. That has to do with another paradox of this, which is that we don't want to see, for lots of complicated reasons, it's difficult for us to see Muslims loving Jews in any way, for political reasons, no doubt. So philo-Semitism is a hugely understudied phenomenon. A lot of people simply dismiss it as anti-Semitism in sheep's clothing. But we scholars need to think through its implications much more, certainly in Western contexts, but also in non-Western contexts. Now, my observation also that the United Arab Emirates is a place that instrumentalizes heritage to give the illusion of historicity and rootedness in a country of very little of either is also not terribly original. Nonetheless, amidst all the shiny buildings and Abrahamic togetherness, I do feel compelled to hold on to the memory of David ben Moshe and all the other Jewish ghosts of the broader Islamic world, close to 1 million of them, as I said, that once existed in these spaces, particularly as the intercommunal history of Jews and Muslims, warts and all, is being repackaged to suit modern, even postmodern imperatives. Thank you.